Welcome to the Center for Homeland Defense and Security Master's Thesis Series. I'm Heather Isvaron, and with me today is Monika Mali, Transportation Security Inspector with TSA. Welcome, Monika.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, you researched something quite outside TSA on Hawala.
I did.
So can you tell us what Hawala is?
Sure. So Hawala is a way to move money in between individuals, and it bypasses the formal financial sector. So for example, let's say you're a migrant worker here from Somalia. You would contact somebody, a Hawaladar in your own community, to send money back home to your family in Somalia. And they could be at a liquor store, maybe, or a 7-Eleven. You would walk in and say, hey, I need to send home this amount of money to my family in Somalia. They would contact a Hawaladar that they have in their own network and say, so-and-so needs to deliver this money, can you give it to his cousin? And you would have a secret passcode that the cousin would give to the Hawaladar to collect the money. And this individual doesn't have to pay any type of fees. The fees that you pay are small compared to the ones that you would pay for using like Western Union, for example. And it's a trusted person in your community that would be able to just deliver the funds, usually with less than 24 hours notice.
And what process would they use to transfer, actually?
And actually, that's a really good question, because you're not physically transferring or couriering any types of funds. What happens is that the Hawaladars will transfer funds among themselves to settle any payments or credits that's owed to them. So they use their own cash pools to be able to deliver those funds.
So they're serving as the banker?
Correct. Yes, exactly.
Understood. Okay. And so that is interesting. How long has that been around?
Actually, it's a very ancient practice. It's practiced mostly in Middle Eastern communities. It has a long history throughout South Asia. It has a history throughout Africa, and it actually predates Western banking. Many times, people will call it as non-traditional, but in reality, these are really the traditional ways that money was moved around the world. Hawala is used by families to send their kids to school, to buy groceries, sanitation services, maybe it's medicine. Aid organizations have increasingly, in the last 5 years, started using Hawala as well. And they're using it to process cash vouchers. Maybe they're delivering aids and services through the Hawala networks, because Hawala has endured for over a millennium. And it's able to function, unlike the Western banking institutions, under great external pressures. And so these are viable means for aid organizations, for example, to distribute aid services, food. Maybe they use them to reach remote locations that they otherwise would not have access to. One of the things that my research also identified was that it had positive effects. The use of Hawala had positive effects on aid worker safety, in that it required less travel time. It required them to not have to undergo, let's say, checkpoints or have to traverse through different terrains that could be hazardous. And it really limited the amount of exposure that aid workers had in the community, which in turn limits their exposure or potential to be impacted by violence.
And so you picked the topic, you've defined the topic, and tell me what methodology you used.
So I looked at case studies. I looked at case studies in Africa and in the Middle East. I specifically looked at communities that use Hawala extensively, not only for terrorism related, because I specifically honed in on how it's used nefariously, but also what about the people that live in these communities and rely on Hawala for their everyday banking. So what I looked at was a way to see what are the two different ends of the spectrum that are related to Hawala.
And what was the most surprising thing that you found in your research?
The most surprising thing was that the United States has taken extensive efforts to regulate Hawala. and rightfully so. It's been abused by terrorist organizations for years and years. It's existed in the United States since the 80s. But after 9/11, the United States took measures to regulate it even further to ensure that it would be stopped and not used for terror financing. But what I found most surprising was that it also created an environment where it was necessary because those actions also adversely impacted the formal sector.
Explain that a little more.
Sure.
What does that mean?
So, for example, we have regulations that require the formal financial sector to be able to detect money laundering schemes. So when we've tightened up the regulations with money laundering, a lot of banks or a good number of institutions have elected to no longer process transactions that they feel may be somehow tied to terrorism. And unfortunately, it impacts communities that are living under de facto regimes, or they're living under the fear of terrorism every day. And these companies or formal financial institutions will no longer want to do business in these places, so they pull out. Inevitably, people still need to bank or function day in and day out. And what happens is that their only option is to turn to these other avenues like Hawala to be able to do their day-to-day banking. And so what happened was we had the unintended consequence where we've tried to tighten the regulations, but what happened instead was that we created an environment where these Hawala and informal value transfer systems can actually thrive because there's no formal financial presence, and it's the only mode to move money.
And so the bad actors are the ones that are controlling those finance systems, or?
It's not necessarily that the terrorists are or nefarious users, criminal organizations are controlling the Hawala networks. It's just that all of the money is commingled, whether it's used for purposes of supporting your family so they could buy food, water, groceries. Maybe they need to send the kids to school, clean water. It's just that all of those funds are commingled. And so it makes it hard for financial regulators to be able to detect it and to deter it from entering the formal financial sector.
So that sounds like a pretty complex topic. Can you tell us what your recommendations were?
Sure. My ultimate findings and my ultimate recommendation is that my research identified that there has been a strong financial exclusion. There's been a wave of financial exclusion that has occurred in these communities. It affects the United States in that this money that enters the global financial network, the US dollar dominates that network. And so some of the findings that I found was that, for example, Islamic State will go and use Hawala networks and abuse Hawala networks by using exchange houses to bypass the formal sector and instead go to the Hawala network to purchase US dollars at a discounted rate. So the integrity of our financial system is what's really at stake.
Does that affect, say, our troops on the ground?
It can, because this is the funds that they're using. This is how they're fundraising. They're buying US dollars at a discounted rate, but they can have a higher purchasing power with that dollar and fund their terrorism operations. So it absolutely would affect the folks that are on the ground.
What are some other findings that you came up with?
One of the other findings that I found was that instead of focusing on regulating Hawala any further, although the regulation is necessary, we can also focus on financial inclusion measures. And the reason why I say that is because the heightened regulation has created environments where Hawala networks and similar networks, alternate money transfer networks, can really thrive. And it's created opportunities for them to outperform the Western methods or the Western financial system. And so it becomes a preferred modality. And by excluding populations, by requiring communities to have identity documents, or maybe they're not literate enough to be able to fill out documents, we've created financial exclusion. And so these communities have no other option but to focus on banking through informal methods, where we really want these communities to be part of the global network and not bypass it.
So where do you think this will go in terms of your research, your findings, and once you get it published? What do you expect to find from your research?
Well, one of the things is that my final ultimate recommendation was to focus on newer technologies to bring in these communities into part of the global financial network and to promote financial inclusion. And by doing that, the United States has opportunity to invest in mobile platforms. So for example, more people throughout Africa and the Middle East have cell phones than they do bank accounts. And so instead of investing in brick and mortar institutions, one thing that the United States can be a forefront leader in is developing those mobile technologies so they can be part of the formal sector and use technologies that are already in place.
So in effect, really leading and promoting inclusion.
Yes, exactly.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate your research.
Thank you. Appreciate it.